Somewhere in the world right now, someone just died. Maybe a minute ago, maybe 30 seconds. And their body, the same biological machine you are living in at this exact moment, has just begun one of the most extraordinary and least understood sequences in all of nature. Not a shutdown, not a stop, a sequence. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of content that makes you think differently about your own existence, hit subscribe. We put out videos like this every week, and the next one might be the one that changes how you see something you've been looking at your entire life. Now, let's talk about what your body has already planned for the moment your heart stops, because the answer is not what you think. And understanding it, step by step, changes everything you believe about the line between life and death. Let's start with the first 2 hours, because this is where most people's understanding of death completely breaks down. You probably picture death the way movies show it. The heart stops, the lights go out, everything freezes, the person is simply gone, and what's left behind is just a body. Still, inert, a husk. That is not what happens. Within seconds of your last heartbeat, your body begins a sequence that is, in its own strange way, deeply orderly, almost mechanical. The first thing that occurs has a clinical name, primary flaccidity. Every single muscle in your body simultaneously loses tension. Every one, all at once. The muscles holding your eyelids closed let go, your eyes may slide open, half-lidded. The muscles keeping your jaw shut slacken, your mouth falls. The sphincters that have been dutifully doing their job every second of your life without you ever noticing them, release. This is the first thing that happens when you die. You have no control over any of it. And it happens to everyone, always, without exception. At the same time, something is happening to your skin. Without your heart pushing blood through 60,000 miles of blood vessels, that blood stops moving. It drains from the surface. Gravity is already winning. Your skin, which had been warm and faintly pink from blood flowing millimeters below its surface, turns pale, waxy, almost translucent. Doctors call this pallor mortis. It can appear within minutes of death. If you have ever seen a body and thought, they look nothing like themselves, this is why. It's not the features that changed. It's the color, the warmth, the aliveness of the skin, and then the cold begins. Your body is a furnace. Right now, at this very second, you are producing heat, a constant byproduct of every chemical reaction keeping your cells alive. The moment those reactions stop, the furnace goes dark, and your body begins cooling at a rate of roughly 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit per hour. This process has a name, algor mortis, from the Latin for cold. And it continues, relentlessly, until your body reaches the temperature of whatever room, field, or forest floor you happen to be lying on. Here's why this matters beyond the biology. Forensic scientists use this cooling rate as a clock. A body's temperature tells investigators with reasonable precision when death occurred. You don't just die, you leave a record. Your body's temperature becomes evidence. But here's what nobody in school, in church, or at a funeral ever told you about these first 2 hours. For most of human history, people had no idea any of this was happening. They couldn't measure it. They couldn't explain it. They watched the color drain from a face they loved, felt the hand go cold, and had no framework to understand what they were witnessing. The biological mechanics of death, what it actually does to a body at the cellular level, was one of the oldest and most terrifying unknowns in the entire human experience. Until science went looking. And what science found, when it finally went looking inside a body in the hours after death, was not the peaceful end we had all quietly hoped for. It was a war. But the first 2 hours are only the opening act. Because something else is already beginning, quietly, invisibly, while your skin goes pale and your temperature drops. Something that forces you to completely reconsider where the boundary between life and death actually sits. Stick with me. Between 2 and 12 hours after death, the real transformation begins. And it starts with your blood. No longer propelled by a beating heart, your blood simply obeys the only force still operating, gravity. It pools in the lowest points of your body, settling deep into the tissue, staining the skin from the inside out. Purplish red patches begin to appear, mottled, spread across the back, the buttocks, the backs of the legs, wherever the body makes contact with the ground. Doctors call this livor mortis, lividity, and it is fixed. If someone moves a body more than 6 to 8 hours after death, those marks stay exactly where they originally formed. Again, a clock, again, evidence. A body narrates its own story to anyone who knows the language, but livor mortis is just the background process. The headline event of this period is something most people have heard of and almost nobody actually understands. Rigor mortis. Here is the real explanation, because the way most people think about it is completely wrong. Your muscles move because of a molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. It is your body's energy currency. Every muscular contraction, every movement you have ever made in your life cost ATP. But here is the counterintuitive part. Releasing a muscle contraction also costs ATP. To relax a muscle, to let go, your body has to actively spend energy. Sustained contraction at the molecular level is actually the default state. Relaxation is the thing that requires effort. When you die, ATP production stops immediately. But the remaining ATP stored in your cells keeps muscle fibers loosely functional for a brief window. Then, as even that last reserve depletes, something irreversible occurs. The proteins that drive muscle contraction, actin and myosin, lock together permanently. They fuse at the molecular level. Without ATP, there is no energy to separate them, no release, no relaxation. Every muscle in your body locks rigid. It begins in the face, the jaw clenches, the eyelids tighten. It spreads downward through the neck, the shoulders, the arms, the chest, and finally the legs, a slow wave of rigidity moving through the body over several hours. Peak stiffness typically arrives around 12 hours after death. A body that was completely limp at the moment of dying becomes, half a day later, almost impossible to move. For centuries, this terrified people in ways that shaped entire cultures. Witnesses saw a body that had been soft suddenly go rigid. They saw limbs shift as different muscle groups locked at different rates. They heard the sounds a stiffening body makes. People were buried alive because of it, family members mistaking the muscular movement of rigor setting in for signs of life. Coffins were retrofitted with bells attached to strings, so the buried could signal if they woke. The fear of being buried alive was so widespread in 18th and 19th century Europe that safety coffins became a minor industry. Entire folklore traditions around reanimated corpses, the walking dead, the undead, have roots in the misunderstood biology of rigor mortis. Now, here is the most remarkable part, and this is the piece that changes the entire story. Rigor mortis does not last forever. Between 24 and 36 hours after death, it begins to fade, and the reason it fades is because the very molecular machinery that caused it is being systematically destroyed. Not from the outside, from within. The body has turned on itself. In the absence of oxygen, your cells begin a process called autolysis, which translates precisely and uncomfortably as self-digestion. The same enzymes your cells use to break down nutrients while you are alive start dismantling the cell walls themselves. Without the regulatory signals that normally control them, they do not stop. They keep going, dissolving. The proteins that lock the muscles rigid are consumed. The body goes limp again, not from relaxation, but from dissolution. And this is when the second army arrives. Your gut contains somewhere between 10 trillion and 100 trillion bacteria. For your entire life, they lived inside you in a carefully maintained balance, kept in check by your immune system, by the physical barriers of your intestinal lining, by the architecture of a living body. The moment you die, that architecture begins to fail. The barriers come down, and the bacteria, which have been processing your gut contents for decades without rest, notice that something has fundamentally changed. There is a much larger buffet available. They migrate through the intestinal walls, into the bloodstream, spreading through the tissue. This process is called putrefaction, and it is the main engine of what most people mean when they say a body decomposes, though that word dramatically undersells what is actually happening. The bacteria do not simply break down the tissue, they transform it, chemically, into its component parts. They produce gases, hydrogen sulfide, methane, carbon dioxide, ammonia, that have nowhere to go and accumulate inside the body. The abdomen swells, the face bloats, the tongue may protrude, and the skin changes color in a sequence that is deeply specific, from the pale of pallor mortis, to greenish, then purplish black, as sulfur compounds react with the iron in hemoglobin and create new pigments entirely. This discoloration typically starts at the lower abdomen, near the cecum, where bacteria are most concentrated, and it spreads outward from there, like a tide. A 19th century physician named John Davy, brother of the famous chemist Humphrey Davy, documented this spreading pattern in careful detail while stationed in the tropics, where the process moved faster than he had ever seen in England. He wrote that watching it was like watching a map being drawn. The body, he said, was writing its own ending. He was right. So who finally understood all of this? Who went looking inside a body when no one else would? The answer is darker than you might expect. For most of recorded history, the study of dead human bodies was illegal, sacrilegious, or both. The medieval church prohibited dissection outright. The body was sacred, it was the physical vessel that would be resurrected on Judgment Day, and cutting it open was considered desecration. This was not fringe theology. This was law, enforced by the same institutions that built cathedrals and crowned kings. Surgeons who needed anatomical knowledge had to obtain bodies secretly, often from executed criminals. When that supply ran dry, they turned to body snatchers, men who robbed fresh graves in the night and sold corpses to anatomy schools by morning. And here's a detail most history books skip over. The word cadaver comes from the Latin cadere, meaning to fall. It was the word Roman soldiers used for the bodies left on battlefields. The fallen. And for most of Western history, once someone had fallen, the secrets inside them were considered off-limits, sacred territory that belonged to God, not to science. The scientist who finally broke that barrier paid for it. Andreas Vesalius, who published the first accurate anatomical atlas in 1543 and is considered the father of modern anatomy, was condemned to death for his dissections. The sentence was eventually commuted to a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which he did not survive. He spent his entire career cutting through centuries of superstition, one body at a time, and the establishment he was overturning made sure he knew it. What he and those who followed him found inside those forbidden bodies was not the simple inert matter that religious authority had described. It was chemistry. It was physics. It was biology operating at full intensity even after the person was gone. The body was not simply dead. It was extraordinarily busy. So here is where all of this lands. Advanced decomposition, what happens in the weeks and months following death, is not chaos. It is ecology. And it is, in its own strange way, one of the most generous things a body does. As soft tissue breaks down, it releases nutrients back into the soil. Everything your body absorbed over the course of your lifetime, every meal, every mineral, every molecule your cells ever processed begins its return. The fat in your cells becomes fatty acids that sink into the earth. The nitrogen locked inside your proteins becomes nitrates that plant roots absorb. Specialist insects arrive in a specific succession, each species appearing in sequence, each playing an assigned role in a biological process that has been running on this planet for hundreds of millions of years. Forensic entomologists can look at which insects are present in a body and tell you within a day or two exactly how long it has been there. Even in death, your body is a habitat, a resource, an active contribution, and ultimately over months or years depending on temperature, moisture, soil composition, and conditions. What remains is the skeleton. Bone is extraordinarily durable. Its mineral structure, a crystalline compound called hydroxyapatite, is stable enough to persist for centuries, sometimes millennia, under the right conditions. This is why we know our ancestors. Their bones survived when every other record was gone. Their bones are the reason we know what they ate, what diseases they carried, what violence they survived or didn't, how old they were, and how hard their lives had been. The skeleton itself eventually fails. Cartilage goes first, the soft architecture of the ears, the nose, the joints. Then, over decades or centuries, bone begins to fragment and demineralize, the calcium returning to the soil, and eventually, nothing that you would recognize as human remains at all. The atoms that made you scatter back into the world, recycled into plants, into water, into air, into other living things that will, in turn, die and scatter and feed the next cycle. You do not disappear, you redistribute. And here is the part that should stop you completely. Every atom currently in your body has been somewhere else before it was in you. The calcium in your bones was once part of marine organisms that lived hundreds of millions of years ago. The iron in your blood was forged in the core of a star that exploded before our solar system existed. The water in your cells has moved through oceans, through ice ages, through glaciers, through rivers, through other living bodies, through the atmosphere and back again for billions of years before it reached you. You are not a fixed thing. You are a temporary arrangement. A configuration of matter that the universe assembled, animated for a span of decades, and will eventually disassemble and reassign. The stages of death that seem so grim, pallor mortis, rigor mortis, autolysis, putrefaction, skeletonization, they are not the end of the story. They are the final chapter of your physical autobiography, but they are also the first chapter of everything those atoms do next. And here is what hits hardest when you sit with all of this long enough. For most of human history, people buried their dead and told stories about where they went. They built monuments. They carved names into stone. They constructed elaborate mythologies to make bearable the moment when the animation left the body. They sat with the mystery because they had no other choice. They could not look inside. They were not allowed to know. We have a choice now. We have the science. We can trace exactly what happens to a human body, molecule by molecule, from the last heartbeat to the final dissolution. We have forensic timelines, chemical maps, temperature equations, bacterial succession charts. We have turned death into data. And somehow, knowing all of it does not make it less mysterious. If anything, it makes it more. Because the more precisely you understand the biology, the more clearly you are forced to confront the question that the biology cannot touch. What was it exactly that was using that body? What is the thing that turned those atoms into a particular person and not into the tree outside your window, or the soil in the field, or the water in the river? Science can tell you what happens to the body after death with remarkable precision. It is never explained. Not once. Not adequately. Not even close. What happens to the person? And that question, the one no dissection, no forensic chart, no biochemical cascade has ever answered, is the one you're going to carry with you now, whether you wanted to or not. For 300,000 years, humans buried their dead and wondered where they went. We built the science to map every stage of what the body does after the final breath. We cracked the code of rigor mortis. We traced the bacterial migration. We named every color the skin turns. We still don't know what we are. We traded the mystery of darkness for electric light and called it progress. We mapped the body's death in extraordinary detail and called it understanding. But the deepest question, the one that drove every culture in history to build temples and write prayers and carve names into stone, is still wide open. And maybe that's exactly what we were supposed to find when we went looking. If this video made you look at something differently today, subscribe. We go this deep every single week into the questions most people are moving too fast to ask. Hit the bell if you want to be there when the next one drops. We'll see you in the next one.